All right, good morning, everyone. Sorry for the delay, a few minutes late here. Don't have anyone asking to come in on Zoom yet this morning. But I've got Jody here and real life with me. Okay. And so here we are today, second day of the contracts class, short month this month because of the holidays. So we are just having the two classes we have a class on Monday and today's class. And so we're just getting down to the nitty-gritty of writing an offer. Monday's class was going over the terms and conditions of the contract itself. I tried to hit on the rights and responsibilities and obligations of both parties and a contract. I don't have to be doing that. And so today we're actually going to get down to what we have to be doing before and during writing the offer. I'm going to try to hit on some of the negotiating items that we can deal with within the contract. But really preparation for writing the offer is also very key here today, and we're going to be talking about that. So I'm going to share screen and going to share with everyone here the power tool that we have available. So these are available in Kristen's power tools. They are in the KW and KC Metro portal. They are also on Digital Chalk, and I can't remember if we still have them on the Facebook page or not, in items, but if there is one there, it might be an older version of this. I tried to update this a little bit earlier this year, and I still need to do some work on it. But because preparing to write an offer starts way before you sit down in front of your device or in front of the paper to write the offer. It starts way before you even show the property. Because there are so many things that, number one, you have to have in place before you show a property these days. You have to have an agreement of some kind with the buyer. It, of course, does not have to be an agency agreement. It needs to be some kind of agreement, though, for payment and some if you're not representing the buyer in an agency agreement, then you also have to make sure that the buyer understands that they could be represented maybe by you, not if you're the listing agent on the property, or by someone else. So lots of things to put into place. So kind of starting with your buyer folder, all of the things that you need in the buyer folder. You need a buyer agreement of some kind. You need the brokerage disclosures for both properties when you're setting up your folder. When you're ready to write an offer, obviously you know which state that property is in, but to set up your initial folder, I recommend that you have both because you never really know where a buyer's going to be ending up. Even though they say they want to stay in Missouri, they may go over into Kansas. Happens more often than you might think. You have the pre-approval letter, because you're not showing any properties before you have a pre-approval letter in hand or proof of funds. Because not every buyer is going to be getting a loan, but you need one of those two things. Number one, to establish on your buyer agreement at what price point you're going to be showing properties. And then you also want to make sure that you're not showing or writing an offer on anything that isn't reflected in their pre-approval letter. And buyers can get various versions of their pre-approval letter. So they may have a lower one for you that may be what you have in your folder, but they've been approved for a higher price point than that. Just make sure you have a pre-approval letter or proof of funds that covers the sale price that you're going to be using on the contract. So you have all of that in your folder. Once you have that pre-approval letter in hand, I really suggest that you have a conversation with the lender. The lender has so much more information about that buyer than will probably show up on the pre-approval letter. There are a lot of different variations of the pre-approval letter. And you want a pre-approval letter, not or a pre-qualification letter. And there is a difference there. It takes a little longer to get a pre-approval letter. But that's really what you want in hand, because that means that the lender's done some of the background stuff already. So you want to make sure the pre-approval is better than pre-qual, but pre-approval or pre-qual, if that's all you have, that's all you have. But so a lot of the pre-approval letters will tell you what price point for the sale, what the maximum loan amount is, and sometimes they'll tell you what the down payment is, but sometimes you have to figure that between what the pre-approval letter says for the sale price versus what it says for the loan amount. So sometimes you have to do a little bit of math there yourself. It may or may not reflect an interest rate. And so that's a conversation to have with the lender and the buyer to see if the buyer is capped at the interest rate. A lot of times the pre-approval letters are written based upon what that day's interest rate is. And if interest rates go up a little bit, that may impact the buyer's ability to buy, especially at that highest price point. So you want to know the down payment amount, what kind of loan it is. Most of the pre-approval letters will tell you into which category the buyer will be falling as far as types of loan, whether it's a conventional FHA, VA, or USDA. But that's certainly something to clarify with both parties, with both the lender and the buyer. So you'll have the down payment. You'll need to know whether they have to max out their interest rate, because that's a term in the contract that we have to deal with, or whether they can float their interest rate if there's a little bit of wiggle room in that interest rate for the buyer. Then moving on from there, and of course, just having a conversation with the lender is just a great idea anyway. You'll things that you need to know if it's a lender that you're not familiar working with is, are they going to be the main contact that you have, or will you be talking with the processor also? I like to also find out if it's a lender that I'm not familiar with, if the underwriter is local, if that's someone that the lender can go in and talk to in case we have a problem later on. But just a nice conversation with the lender is always a really, really good thing to have, and check on their availability. To begin with, too, you need to know if you can call them for an updated pre-approval letter at 7 o'clock at night, if they're going to be responding to that, or over a weekend, because that's when we do our business, right? That's when typically we are writing offers. So just a nice conversation with the lender is a great place to start before maybe even go out and show properties. All right, then moving on, preparing to write a contract. When you go show a property, when you're getting ready to go show a property, regardless of the source of the information on that property, whether it's something that the buyers brought to you and say, hey, we're really interested in this one, or if you're sending them automatic emails through MLS, regardless of the source of that, you need to go out and find that property on MLS, or find out whatever you can about the property in case it's not on MLS. If it's a for sale by owner, that's a whole different preparation that we'll get to at some point after the first of the year, because next month we're not doing any contracts classes. December gets kind of jam-packed, and so I won't see you again for contracts class until January. But at some point we'll talk about doing an unrepresented seller. But okay, back on track here this morning. So get as much information as you possibly can about the house and share that with your buyer. If it's on MLS, make sure that you are getting the seller's disclosure and the lead-based paint disclosure, and that they are ready and available for you and ready for you to send on to your buyer for possible signatures later on. But I still just initials and signatures, but I also just think, send that seller's disclosure before you ever go make, I would say, before you ever even make the appointment to show the property. There may be something on that seller's disclosure that will discourage the buyer from looking at that property. Some buyers won't look at a property if it's had any kind of foundation work on it. Especially if they're thinking about needing basement space for a rec room or a family room or something like that in the future. Because sometimes some of that foundation work can kind of get in the way of what kind of finish you can put in a lower level. So there may be something about that property that you just might not even want to go see that will show up on the seller's disclosure. I also ask the buyers, when possible, to go drive by the property. There may be a property next door that is not well kept. And so that's a reason that the buyer's not going to want to see the property, or it may back up to, at the very least, you want to look at the parcel map. So if it backs up to commercial or backs up to something else, you're also checking the flood maps, the FEMA flood maps that are available to you on MLS. So check out all of that stuff. Have the buyer drive by and kind of check out the neighborhood a little bit. There's nothing worse than making the appointment and then everybody shows up at the house and the buyer says, "Oh, I don't even want to go in because of this house next door." Well, then you've got, another whole can of worms, because you have to then can't try to cancel that appointment, and that gets to be kind of hairy. So many things that you do before you ever go even set the appointment and go show the property. But then, all right, so everything checks out okay. Now we are at the property, we're walking in. You and your realtor eyes, and I know as newer agents, you're thinking, "Linda, I don't have realtor eyes yet." And maybe you don't, but you will start to develop them. Once you've been through an FHA appraisal or any appraisal, once you've been through inspections, once you've been out working with the buyers and even working with sellers, you are going to start realizing the things that you need to check out while the buyer's checking out the space and the decor and the property. And you're doing that too. It's just you're also doing some underlying things as well. You're taking a look at the foundation to see if you see any obvious cracks. One of the things that I always do, especially in older homes, not so much in newer homes, but in older homes, I will go open the electrical panel to see how much power is coming into the house and see if it's enough that's going to cover, everything that we do in today's world, all of our electronics and all of that. Older properties sometimes are still at the 60 or 100 amp service, and that's not enough for our modern lives. And you're also looking to see, and buyers look at this too, but you're looking to see if you see any cracking or settlement indications throughout the house. You're looking at the ceilings, especially in the corners of the outside walls, to see if you see any yellowing stains from previous or current water intrusion. So and you will develop those eyes. I promise you will. But even before you start developing your realtor eyes, you're looking at page 7 of the seller's disclosure to see what is remaining with the property per the seller and what is not, what's operating and staying, or what's excluded. You're looking at everything on the seller's disclosure. You need to make sure that the water source is public water. I mean, if it's not, it's just another step that you have to take. It's seeing if the sewer system is the public sewer system or if it's on a private septic system. So you're looking at all of that stuff, but you're also, as you're walking through the property, taking a look at what's on page 7. Page 7 of the seller's disclosure is that page that we ask the seller to address every single line about the systems and the personal property in the house. What's staying, what's not staying, what's operating and as it's expected to, and what's excluded from being used as an unacceptable condition during our inspection period. So you're looking at all of that as you're walking through the property. If you're seeing shelves in the garage, you're asking the seller, the buyer, as you're walking through them. Well, the seller doesn't address these. The contract and the seller's disclosure say that shelving, attached shelving stays with the property. Unattached shelving can go with the seller. So buyer, if these appear to be unattached, is it going to be a problem for you if the seller takes these? Same thing with that freestanding workbench over there in the corner of the basement. The window treatments, all of those things that are reflected on the seller's disclosure, you are verifying with your buyer. The seller says that the refrigerator's not staying. Is that okay with you? That the washer and dryer are not staying? Is that okay with you? Or even vice versa, if that seller says that the refrigerator is staying with the property, are you okay with that? So all of those things as you're walking through the property. I do tell my buyers usually, even before we go out looking, that they're probably going to know in their gut the first 30 seconds they're in the property, whether this is the one or this is not the one. If you are starting to, and pretty much that's true. And so if the buyer's getting excited and starting to talk about this one as well, they're starting to bring their furniture in, that kind of thing. That's a really good indication that they might be wanting to write an offer on this one. So make sure that you are talking about those things as you are getting those buyer signals, buying signals from your buyer there. Because those are things that we have to address on the contract. And so better to be making your notes about that now. You're still probably going to have to address some things as you're writing the offer, but it's best to be prepared with those things. Then as the buyer says, yep, we want to make an offer on this one. And here's one of the most important things that you can say is, I tell you what, buyer, it's going to take me an hour to 2 hours just to get ready to write the offer. So why don't you go get something to eat or something to drink, depending on, what the day is, not alcohol. You can't write a contract with someone that's been drinking alcohol, but, go get a glass of tea or something, or a cup of tea as we are coming into the cooler weather. And then we'll either meet up back at the office or at their home, because you can do this at their home, or make a plan for a phone call. But either way, whichever way that is, again, I'm preparing you for this, not your buyer. You are going to be going over the contract with your buyer. I don't want anyone in here to just fill out a form and send it to the buyer and say, here, sign this. That's not the way we do our business. We need transparency, so there are some things in there that we have to disclose, and the buyers need explanation. Even if it's someone that's bought and sold property, for several times over their lifetime, our contracts change all the time. You're going to be that agent that does explain it, because their agents probably in the past have not explained the contract to them. So they may not, even if they bought 5 houses over the last 15 years, they may not fully be aware of what our contracts say. You're going to be the one that does that. That's why on Monday, when I mentioned that, there's no shame in having your own cheat sheet available to you. Number one, that tells you, and Jody's showing me his right there. So number one, what information goes in the blanks and where you get that information, and then also your little thumbnail explanation of what every paragraph is all about in the contract. So, okay, so tell your buyer, I'll meet up with you in another hour or so. Or if you're going to be writing the contract, you don't let the buyer go without getting some information from them. If you're going to be meeting up with them or on the phone with them as you are writing the contract, you can ask these questions as you get to them. But if their plan is, well, just send it to us when it's ready, once again, you don't do it without explanation, but there are questions that you have to clarify with them beforehand. Number one is, well, what do you think you're going to be offering? The preparation, so kind of coming back, kind of taking a step back from that, part of the preparation for you is to, and I really, really suggest this, I do this for every buyer that I possibly can. I tell them as we're splitting up, that one of the things I'm going to do for them is I'm going to do a market analysis for them just as if they already owned the property and had called me to put it on the market to sell it. So the exact same market analysis. So if you are using the ones that are available to you on MLS, that's great. I really kind of hope that everyone here has gone to the trainings that David has, or I don't know if we've got those on digital chalk or not. I have to check. On what Kristen calls the big dog CMA. I just call it the CMA. It is kind of a big dog thing, but it's beautiful, it's colorful, it's got so much information on it, but that's what I use. And as I tell my buyer, I'm going to do a full market analysis on this property. That is not telling them what to offer on the property. And buyers will ask you that, well, what do you think we should offer? You cannot answer that question. Please, please, please don't ever answer that question with a number. If you tell them something too low and they miss out on it, then you're in trouble. If you tell them something too high and they find out that they could have bought it for less, you're in trouble. So never, ever, ever give them a number. But that's when I do say, you know what, I'm going to do the CMA is going to give us a range. It's going to have a high and low on it. And you will determine from that where you feel comfortable. Another thing that I do try to tell buyers, I kind of skipped over this too, when we first start out looking is, I really, really hope that they get to see several properties. I know in certain markets, in certain price ranges, we're still seeing a very competitive market, and there's not always a lot of time. If you go see, this is the first house they see and they fall in love with it and they want to write an offer, you may not have time to go show them other properties. But as the market is starting to soften a little bit, I am back to saying to my buyers, I want you to see several properties. We may circle back around and write an offer on the very first one that you've seen, but buyer, I want you to become an expert in this market. I want you to see what pricing is like. I want you to see what you can get for this price, what kind of condition, what age of property. So I want my buyers to become experts in that. That it's still not going to prevent them from asking you what they should offer, but you're giving them back their power and their strength to make that decision themselves. Then also with your market analysis. Unless I am really, really, really pressed for time on something, I will do that a market analysis, even if we don't get the opportunity to go see other properties. So send that to them because again, it does give a price range and this is just based on square footage. They still need to make their offer based on condition, based on how well it meets their needs, based on the other amenities of the property or the neighborhood. Because the market analysis, even the ones that you're doing on MLS are just based on square footage. So there are lots of other things that feed into that decision as well. All right, so then the preparation so you're doing the market analysis. You are checking to make sure if it's an active homes association that you have and can provide to the buyer a copy of the CCRs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. That's usually in a lot of legalese and kind of hard to wade through a little bit. What's really great is when the seller, the listing agent can provide just a sheet of things. It's just a document that shows what the HOA covers and what the homeowner's responsible for if you're getting into a maintenance provided property, or kind of breaks down some of the restrictions that your buyer, if they buy this property, is going to have to abide by in the property. No sheds in the backyard, maybe limited types of play equipment for children, if they have to paint a certain color palette. So all of those things are things that it's great if you can have them up front before you make the offer. And again, helping the buyer decide, is this really the property I want to put an offer in on? And you're checking all of those things that you can easily check out to begin with. As you are walking through the property, you're making your notes on the buyer's answers on, well, no, can we ask for the washer and dryer? Can we ask for the refrigerator? Anyone that spent much time with me in the classroom knows that my preferred answer to that is, well, it's better if we don't. But of course we can, right? But remember, you have to have special verbiage when you're adding those things into the contract. So you need to know those things. Then as you are then again preparing to write the offer, and we really are going to get to this power tool. I'm just telling you the things that you need to do before you sit down and double check all of these things. So you need to know what the buyer's thinking about a price point. An important thing for you to clarify right up front is that they may or may not know that they are going to need to provide some kind of earnest deposit with the offer. Earnest deposit is not required, it's not an essential element of our contract. So if a buyer doesn't have the ability to do that, it's not necessarily a deal breaker, but chances are the seller is going to expect something. Some sellers will not seriously consider an offer that doesn't have any earnest deposit. Some sellers will have indicated that they really won't consider anything that doesn't have less than 1% of the sales price as the earnest deposit. So be preparing your buyer for that. That's really something that you should be talking about way early in the process, but remind them of this as you are preparing to make that offer. You're also checking, I think it's a really good idea before you split up from the buyer at the property to check for 2 dates for them. You need the closing and possession date. If it's a vacant property, that can be the same. If it's an occupied property, you might have the conversation with the buyer at the time. Well, we can close on this day. We'll see what the seller needs. Some sellers ask for a day or two after closing because some sellers feel that they need their funds in hand before they can move on to do something else. Some sellers have made arrangements that they don't necessarily need to. There are ways that we can arrange our closings so that they happen back to back. So it's what we call table funded. So the sellers never actually get their proceeds. It's just from one title company or one transaction to another transaction. But if it's still an occupied property, asking if the buyer would be comfortable allowing the seller a day or two after closing before giving up possession. And make sure that your closing date is not on a holiday or weekend or not affected by a holiday or long weekend in the meantime. If the lenders told you that it's going to take 30 days for closing, and here we are coming into the holiday season, but most months have something that affect either a long weekend or a day that banks aren't working. So make sure that you're accommodating those days that the bank's not going to be available and the title company's not going to be available as you are figuring your closing date. So kind of work that out with them again before you ever leave them at the property. So what we really like to see, a lot of buyers like to close at the end of the month because it minimizes their interest, prepaid interest that they're paying on the loan, which is a way to help protect your buyer. If your buyer is under a lease agreement, they may want to time it so that they have a few days before their lease ends to get moved and not have to move all in one day, 1 or 2 days, that they might kind of stretch out. If they're thinking about doing some painting or putting new flooring in the property before they move in, because that's always easier to do before you move in. So they want a week or two in there. So make sure that you are talking with them about these things and adjusting your calendar according to their needs that way. So checking for that, but then you're also checking for if we write our offer tonight, chances are if we're going to get an acceptance, it's going to happen in the next day or two. We are asking for how many days in our inspection period. That's another thing to be checking with the buyer. If they're going to be out of town, starting if we're here on Sunday night, they're going to be out of town Monday and Tuesday. You might want to extend your inspection period because the buyer really needs to be there, really should be there, if not for the full inspection, at least for the wrap up of it, meet with the inspector. And so the 10 days is still plenty of time, but once again, make sure you're counting that 10-day period may include 2 weekends, and you're not going to get inspectors out. Some inspectors work on Saturdays, but you're not going to get one out on Sunday for sure. And if you're getting some of the secondary inspections, if you need to get a roofer out or an HVAC person, they're not going to come out on a weekend. So I always try to extend that anyway, but just make sure that you're adjusting what you need to request based upon what the buyer's current situation is. So if they're going to be out of town for a couple of days, you might want to extend your inspection period and tell them that and say, well, then what is your availability for inspections over the next 7 days, after that. So all these things that you need to be talking with your buyer about before you leave the property. I think I've covered most of that. Oh, no, I haven't. All right, big one, big, huge one here. We also have to ask the buyer about the home warranty. If they are going to want a home warranty put in place or not. If they do want a home warranty put in place, are we going to be asking the seller to provide it, or is the buyer willing to provide it themselves? And again, we'll get into kind of the negotiating parts of all of this, but ask them about the home warranty. And if they know at this point whether they want to buy it themselves or ask the seller to buy it. Part of that is based on what you're seeing on the seller's disclosure and what you're seeing in person at the property. If the HVAC system is 15 years old, chances are the inspector is going to tell you that it's at the end of its expected life. And so, and Murphy's Law tells us that that HVAC system is going to fail probably within the first month that the buyer's in the house. So that's just the way that works. So checking out all of those things, if the appliances are old and staying with the property. So because the home warranty covers plumbing, electrical, appliances, cooling and heating. Peach, everybody remember that. Okay, so having that conversation with the buyer as well, while you're still there at the property to check out these things and together looking at the seller's disclosure. All right, so now you can let the buyer go get their dinner or their lunch or whatever time of day it is. Now here's your power tool. Told you I'd finally get back to it. All right, ready to make an offer. You must have these in place first. Your agency disclosure brochure for whichever, make sure you have that for whichever state the property is located in. Again, as I said, I think you should have both of them in your buyer folder just to begin with. Your exclusive buyer agency contract, or we like to, that's our preference. That's always our preference. But if you've got an open or non-exclusive buyer agency agreement, that's fine too. If you are not representing either party, if it's an unrepresented buyer and you are working with an unrepresented buyer, then we have the transaction brokerage form also not representing either party. So that gets a little more complicated. So again, we just prefer that you have that buyer agency agreement. And so that's in your contract, your pre-approval letter proof of funds. Now, this is not all inclusive of everything that I want you to have in as contracts coach and broker that I want you to have in your file, but for the offer purposes, we have to have these. Documents you'll need for your offer, the residential real estate sale contract, and I'm here pretty soon. I'm going to flip over into the dot loop and we'll look at the contract again. I'm also going to be opening up probably our contracts challenge property and probably do all of that after break to show you where everything is that you need that's on MLS. But you'll need the contract itself. If you are, again, most of the time you're going to be doing this through dot loop. Some of you may choose to work with DocuSign, but dot loop is probably our preference as well. Or you might have some buyers that don't want to or can't do online signatures. So you're going to be doing this in person, in writing, and it doesn't have to be in person, but in writing. Most of the time, if we're doing it in writing, you are face-to-face with them, which I think is still fine. That's the way that it's not the way most agents do things these days, but I think it's perfectly fine. In fact, I really would kind of prefer that you're face-to-face, but I know that's not realistic. So whichever way you're doing it, the electronic version of it or the handwritten version, but you need the contract in front of you. A copy of the pre-approval letter of proof of funds, because that's going to be sent along with your offer. Doesn't become part of our contract, but it does get sent along with your offer. A copy of the earnest money. Now, again, this is kind of old fashioned in that most of the time our buyers are not going to be giving us a check, but you are still verifying with them how much they're going to be putting down and in what form they're going to be making that earnest deposit. Most of the time it's wire transfer, but you will still have buyers that will want to write a check. If that's the case, it's gotten to be acceptable for us just to use a photocopy of the check made out as it's supposed to be made out. You know, back in the old days, we actually did collect the check itself, but a photocopy of it completely made out is acceptable right now to include, because all we're sending with our offer is that, yes, we're making this earnest deposit in this amount. We're prepared to do that. So you're not sending the actual check with the offer anymore, but you are with the with a copy of it, or you're letting on the contract, letting the seller know in what form that earnest deposit is going to be made. The seller's disclosure addendum that you've already discussed with the buyer, but you're also going to be applying the buyer's initials on every page of that and their signature on page 8. So you have to have that. We will talk about, when we get to the contract, we'll talk about what happens if there's not one. Really, really, really though, ask for one. Oh, I missed a whole step here. I was thinking I was getting to this point kind of early. As you are leaving then your buyer at the property, so back up just a little bit here with me. So you've left the property with your buyer, and it's fine for you to say this to your buyer. Well, as I am, your agent, as I am going back to my office or going to my device to start writing this, to start prepare to write this, I'm going to be calling the listing agent. And these are things that and I would tell your buyer what you're going to be saying and asking of the listing agent. Number one, I always, and I tell my buyers this, and it is true what I do, call the agent. And unless I know that they were in competition, that kind of thing, if it's just, if it's property that's been on the market for a couple of months, kind of present it to the listing agent as well. Yeah, my buyers are kind of thinking, that they might want to put an offer in, not letting the listing agent know that my buyers are jumping up and down with excitement on this. Yeah, but just kind of, minimizing that. We're thinking about making an offer. Number one, listing agent, do you have any other offers in hand or that you are expecting? And don't think that just because the property's been on the market for 2 months that that's not going to happen. Because again, one of Murphy's laws in real estate is house sits on the market for 4 months. We've had 3 total showings. All of a sudden we get 2 or 3 offers on it, all in the same afternoon. That does happen. So if that agent does say to you, well, someone else just called me this afternoon. We had another showing, calling and asking these same questions. So I don't know, they may be writing one. You can say, well, will you let me know if you do receive one? They may or may not be able to do that, and they may or may not tell you that they're able to do that, because remember, that's a question that we ask on our listing agreement, and most brokers do have that in their listing agreement. Can you tell anyone about the existence of other offers? So, but again, don't think that they're fibbing to you. If they tell you that, and sometimes they do. So if they're real cagey about it, it's like, well, I've got some people kind of circling around. Well, yeah, okay. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But if they do tell you that there's another offer coming in or that they have it, don't discount that. Then what you might say is, and if they do have another offer, do you have any, you're asking them, do you have any idea of the terms of that offer? Again, they may or may not be able to tell you that, but sometimes you get chatty agents that will say, well, they indicated, or if they've got it in hand, well, it is. So listen, you're entitled to ask whatever you want to ask. Whether or not they're going to answer you is a whole different thing. Then you also and I tell my buyers, and I'm going to be asking this, but I've verified this information with my buyers to begin with. How can we accommodate the seller? It's kind of gotten to the same question that Elizabeth and David and I, and Kristen and all of your coaches, are asking you to ask your seller, what's most important to them, money or time? You're kind of trying to figure out the same thing about that seller. Do they want to close quickly? Would they rather have an extended closing? There may be an indication of that in MLS. Sometimes it's something like that in the comments that the seller would prefer a 60-day closing, or whatever. So make sure you're verifying that information with your buyer. Can you accommodate that? If you can't accommodate the time, we may need to do some, may need to be more flexible on the money, right? So, so you're trying to determine that from this, from your listing, from the listing agent on this property. What's important to that seller? You know, and if my buyers are flexible, and it's okay for me to say that as for my buyer to that listing agent, absolutely, I'll say that. Well, my buyers are real flexible. They're in a month-to-month lease. They can accommodate whatever closing and possession the seller would need. So, you know, I wouldn't get into money things at this time, but any other way that they can accommodate. So, and lots of ways that that will come up as well. Okay, so here we are. All right, now I'm back to my phone. All right, thanks for taking that little detour with me. All right. The lead-based paint disclosure addendum. So again, if the property is built before 1978, that is a federally required document. You may start seeing different versions of that out there than the one that we are currently using. I think that KCRAR is going to be using a different form here coming up pretty soon. So just get used to it, but there has to be one. We can sometimes slide by without the seller's disclosure, but there has to be a lead-based paint. And so if there's not one, we'll talk about how to deal with that in the contract when we get there. Any documents in the MLS supplements. Again, we'll talk about that as we get into, as I pull up the MLS property on and share that with you here. But a lot of listing brokers will have their affiliated business disclosure and franchise addendum that they want the buyers to sign as well. There may be other documentation. There may be a lead-based paint, or I'm sorry, the legal description. There may be an in its present condition addendum that we need to deal with as we are heading into this time of year. There may be a cold weather inspection waiver. So if it's a foreclosure, they're going to have all kinds of other documents. If it's a new construction, they're going to be all kinds of other documents. So we'll get into that. So make sure that you are looking in MLS to make sure that you are familiar with all of the other documents that might be necessary for this contract. Are required. Oh, we have key partners in there. See, I didn't change that when I changed the form. I did put the new logo up at the top, but I didn't change this. So KW Key Partners is now KW and KC Metro. So the required documentation here that are not included with your offer, but we do require them in your folders. Your buyer's estimated expense worksheet. I cannot stress this enough. As you are writing up the offer and before you send it for signatures, you have to do an estimated closing cost worksheet based upon that offer. And there are two versions of it available. There's the one through KCRAR, there's the one through KW and KC Metro. The one in KWKC, I think, well, they both have two. I think the KCRA has two. Maybe it doesn't, but I think it does. Now I have to go back and look. I know I've slept since I looked at it last time. Two columns. The first column is going to be for the offer that your buyer's making. Prepare your buyer, especially as we're coming into the softening market, is if they're making a low offer, prepare your buyer for what you think might be a counter offer that's going to be coming back to them. That's why the two columns are there. Here's what your offer is. Here's what a possible sale price might be. And is this okay too? You know, kind of thing. But please, I cannot stress this enough. You will be doing that estimated proceeds worksheet before getting signatures on your contract. All of you fresh new people, you're going to start learning how to do it right. Can't tell you how many experienced agents we have to chase down to get that in the folder before they get paid. Right? So we hold that up. Okay. Your exclusive buyer agency contract, of course, we talked about that earlier, and the company franchise disclosure addendum. That's now actually the affiliated business disclosure. We've put our franchise addendum within our listing agreement and buyer agency agreement. So I still have some work to do on this form. So we'll get another version of it ready eventually. So but again, you get your signature on the buyers and that goes into your folder here. We do not ask for signatures of the other party in the transaction for that. All right, writing an offer. First, call the listing agent. So we've already covered that. Ask what's going on with the property. Are there any other offers at second showings? That's another way of showing it that there's interest in the property. What's most important to the seller in an offer, etc. You don't want to do all the work in writing an offer to find out that they just accepted something else. Also, you need to know how to position your buyers. If there are multiple offers, you need to submit a clean offer and not ask for a lot of extras. So that's why we want to know if there are other offers. Are we going to need to be competitive? Your buyer may decide, oh no, if there's another offer, I don't want to get into a bidding war. That's perfectly okay too. So that's really important information for you to gather there. Second bullet point, do a CMA of the neighborhood. I talked about that. And buyers need to determine their offer price, the earnest deposit amount and form, the closing and possession dates. Oh, closing costs. I forgot about that one as we're getting there too. So let's move on though. Home warranty, inspection period, any additional inclusions. We talked about that. Anything that the buyer wants that the seller says is not conveying with the property on the seller's disclosure. And exclusions would be in there too. Any additional terms or conditions. I know I skipped over expiration of the offer. Any additional terms or conditions. That's if, that dead trees in the backyard that we want removed. Or that above ground swimming pool that we want taken out. Or, any of those other additional terms and conditions. Let's go back up to the closing costs. Again, on your pre-approval letter, you're going to know down payment amount. What it's probably not going to show you under any circumstances is how much money the buyer has. And so that's it. Then again, another conversation for you to have with the buyer, borrower, and the lender. Are we going to need to ask for closing costs, for seller to pay closing costs in our offer? If the buyer's using every penny that they've scraped together for their down payment, then we are definitely going to need to ask for closing costs to be paid by the seller. And that's one of the important terms of our contract. Can't believe I skipped right over it earlier. All right, so info you need to fill out the sales contract, the legal names of your buyers, which you have on your buyer agency agreement. That's the best time to get that is Bob and Betty. How do you want to be on the deed? How do you want to be entitled to the property? Is it Bob and Betty or is it Robert and Elizabeth? And do you use middle initials? Is there a junior, senior, second, third involved in any of that? So their legal names, how they want to be on the deed to the property. Legal names of the sellers. You will find that on some of the MLS documents that we'll get to after break time here. Any MLS supplement or legal description. So you'll need to either copy and paste that from the tax records, which I'll show you on MLS, or there may be a legal description addendum already included in the MLS documents. Any MLS supplements that are available to you and they want signed. Financing terms, well, we talked about that. The listing agent's role, we'll talk about that when we get back and look at an MLS. Listing agents and listing brokers information, we'll talk about that too. And then the signatures as they are required. All right, so let's take our break now. It's 9:52. I'll see you all in 10 minutes. And then when we come back, we're going to be looking at the contract and at MLS. Anyone else has popped in? All right, we're back. Still no one else joining us on Zoom, and still just me and Jody in the classroom, but that's okay. I'm sure that there are people out there that are watching this on as the video on Zoom, and so everything applies there that I'm going to say here. The cheat sheets that I have are available to you if you don't already have one. Email me contractscoach@kwink. I'm sorry, let me start over. Contractscoach@kwinkc.com. I will send you the contract cheat sheet. I'm happy to send you a copy of the Ready to Write an Offer power tool that we just talked about. I've got cheat sheets for the estimated buyer's closing costs. So, there's really no excuse for you not to be somewhat prepared for all of this. Of course, we also want you to be participating in all of our contracts challenges, as many as you can. We do kind of have the requirement to graduate from launch that you have completed at least one and participated in at least one contracts challenge, that I've at least seen a practice contract that you have written, even if the timing for the contracts challenge doesn't meet your schedule. So, because this is really important, as Kristen, points out in her emails, and you certainly are going to hear me say it as well, that this is, all of the lead generation that you do, that's all very, very important for your business. You are developing your business. But once you have your business, your job is to get under contract with those people. So the contract is the most important tool that you have for your job. And a complete understanding of the contract is imperative for you to be able to do your job well. So, all right, all of that. Okay, Linda's got the lecture out of her system there. So I'm going to share screen here at the two things, and we are going to kind of cut this a little bit short because we are starting the new training program, or our preview of the new training program today at 11 o'clock. So I'm going to cut it a little bit short to make sure that everyone's set up and prepared to watch that. Make sure that, I don't know if Kristen's doing that via Zoom or not, has she said? I think so. I think you were supposed to be here in person for this. So anyway, so share screen again. And the two things that I'm going to share, we're going to get back to the contract. What did I do with it? There it is. Okay. And in my contracts class folder in .loop, you'll have your own folder there. Going to pull up the contract here. But I've also pulled up our the house, the property that we're using for our contracts challenge this month. And this is November of 2025. For those of you again watching it in the future, 4915 West 79th Street, and it's still showing as active. We're actually wrapping up our contracts challenge tonight. The offers are due, and we will be presenting them and deconstructing them at Wednesday Night Warriors tonight. Property is still on the market. It's still active here. You read all of this. It's not an MLS class, and I think most of you participating in this have probably gone through your MLS training, and I hope you've gone on and played around with MLS and getting more and more familiar with that. But a couple of the things that, again, in preparation for writing an offer, looking at that list, ready to write an offer here, we are looking here at the view documents. And this particular one, they don't have them named here, our 2025 dates, so we know that they were active or current. But here's our lead-based paint disclosure addendum. Down here is where your buyer is going to be initialing. We're going to want your buyer to initial, because it just real briefly here, this seller is saying that they've done everything, they've filled this out to the best of their knowledge, that they have no knowledge of lead-based paint on the property. They have no reports or records pertaining to the lead-based paint. On this form, then, the buyer's not receiving any reports or test results from the seller, so they will not initial line 32. But your buyer will initial line 34 that they've received the pamphlet. Oh yeah, that's one of the other things that we put in all of our buyer folders in .loop is that EPA lead-based paint brochure that's available on the KCRAR templates in dotloop. I don't care if your buyer says they're just going to be looking at new construction. You still share that lead-based paint pamphlet with them. We can't make anyone read anything, but sharing it with them through dotloop is your evidence that you have performed what you are required to do per the federal lead-based paint disclosure laws, and that is make sure that the buyer's aware that lead-based paint is a danger. So, and giving them that pamphlet is fulfilling your obligations there. So we have them initial that they've received that pamphlet, and then we also have them initial on 936. And then also check one of the two boxes. Line 37 is the one that you will probably most often check. You'll have to put the check box in there and then the check mark in there that the buyers received an inspection period during which they could have the property tested for lead-based paint. I've been selling real estate for 40 years as of this year. I have never once had a buyer test for lead-based paint. What we do is just prepare them that, if the house was built before 1978, chances are it's got lead-based paint in it. If you're going to be doing any work to the property, take all proper precautions, including wearing masks. If you're going to be scraping some of that paint, make sure that you remove all of the paint scrapings. You don't want cracked and peely paint, friable paint, on the property. The only time that you would put the check box and the check mark on line 39 is if your buyer has waived their rights to do any inspections. Not just waiving their right to do a lead-based paint, if they've waived their right for inspections. Again, this is filled out properly. This was all done by hand. So there are sellers out there that want to do things in ink by hand. So our listing agent has initialed there that they have informed the seller of the seller's responsibilities and obligations. Our sellers have signed. The reason I'm going over this form is because you will be applying your buyer's signatures on this. They are initialing what they need to initial up here on the first page. They are signing on the second page, and you, as the licensee assisting the buyer, are signing on the second page. That's that. The only other thing that is in this listing, as far as documentation, is the seller's disclosure. And it looks like the seller, that was one of the things that I looked at on here, does look like the seller has filled in most of what they needed to do. The property was built before 1958, so we know that it needed the lead-based paint, and so it's there. They've owned the property for 5 months. So they're, surprisingly, they're not saying, new or limited knowledge, or I've never lived in the property or whatever. Oh, that's yet one of the other things here too. Sellers never occupied the property. That is not checked. So they apparently have lived in the property. As I was going through all of this, it did appear to me, choosing this property for the contracts challenge, that they had filled in, they had answered most of the questions, and that they then also gave explanations where the explanations are asked for. Whenever there's a yes answer, we always have the explanations. They do tell us that they don't know the age of they've only owned the property for 5 months. They don't know the age of the HVAC system, but they did have it inspected 5 months ago, probably. And not that all of this isn't important, but we deal with all of this in another class in another time. They do tell us that all new appliances in 2025. I'm getting back to the page 7 of our 8-page seller's disclosure. They did fill in, it looks like everything they needed to fill in here on page 7, telling us that things are operating and staying. We're looking to see, I'm going to show you down here in the kitchen appliances, the refrigerator, the stove, dishwasher, disposal, freezer, yes, and then the operating and staying refrigerator there. Over here, there is no, that really shouldn't be a dash there, but what our assumption is, I mean, they really should say in A, and there that it's not staying or it's not there at all. I didn't go to this property, so I doubt if there's a washer dryer there, but if they put a dash there, we're assuming that they mean it's not there. So, all right, because they really are supposed to put either NA, OS, or EX, or NS beside everything there, but we can kind of figure out what it is they're talking about. Sellers have signed. You're going to be applying your buyer signatures at the bottom of this too. All right, then we get back to our listing. I'm going to keep that pulled up because as we are going through the contract, I'm going to be referring back to the MLS information sheet where you find some of this information. Okay, seller's name. As we go back to our seller's disclosure back here, which is why I kept that pulled up. This is where I would pull the seller's name from the seller's disclosure. Yes, it's available in the tax records, and we'll get to that here in just a minute, but tax records aren't always updated, and especially if we know that the sellers only owned the property for 5 months. Our version of the tax records may not be completely updated, the ones that we easily access. You can always go to the courthouse, and there are other places that we can go to find the really updated information, but to make it easy for us, if there's a seller's disclosure, I'm going to pull the seller's name from the seller's disclosure because this is something that they filled out, would have had to have approved. So this one says that it's NOBE, not sure how to say that, NOBE Real Estate LLC. So that's what we're going to put on line 4. Our buyers' names, and since it's an LLC, we write LLC. It's not our job to make sure that they are providing a copy of the LLC to prove that whoever's signing this is the signator. That's an assumption that we make. If it's our seller, then we always tell them, well, I don't need a copy necessarily of your paperwork, but the title company will. So anyway, we take it at face value for what's here. But your buyer's name, that's why we ask on our buyer agency agreement how the buyers want to be on title on a property. We're pulling that over because the title company is going to pull from this document how the deed is going to be made out. So we want the buyer's preferred name on here. And of course, it does say right up there on line 1 in bold and underlined that we indicate marital status. So ASP for a single person, AMC for a married person. We're getting and what we're putting on lines 20 through 23 is the common street address. Get that from MLS. What we put in, and make sure you're putting the county in, the legal description. As we go back to MLS back here, these clickable tabs up here at the top, just under the property street address, we go to the tax tab. And we come down here for our legal description. Juniper Hill, lot 18. Juniper Hill apparently only has 1 block, or otherwise we would have a block number in there, but this is our lot and block legal description. Pretty short and sweet. So we would copy and paste that. I can't do that because well, yeah, I do have this in, so I'll show you how you do that. So copy and paste is real easy. And just stop it. PBC is the is a tax number. Don't need the PVCs. Okay. So copy and paste. Come on. There you go. All right, so that populates there. Easy enough to do. This list is the same thing as I said on Monday in our class. This list is the exact same pre-printed list that's on the seller's disclosure. So there should be no confusion on what we expect to remain with the property, but make sure you are aware of what's on that list. You're asking the buyer if any of these things are missing, then also as you're taking your final walkthrough through the property. Additional inclusions would be if there were a washer and dryer on the property and our buyer wanted that. Exclusions would be, so the buyers walk through and seen that refrigerator and say, oh no, I've got a much better refrigerator than I'm bringing. I don't want that one. I want them to take that out. Same thing with any of that stuff that's on there. If they don't like that particular dishwasher or they don't like that particular stove, we can always ask the seller to remove that. So that's what's in additional exclusions there. Additional terms and conditions would be if we're asking the seller to remove that dead tree from the northeast corner of the backyard. If we are going to be making any concessions to the seller, that's where we would put this. As I said on Monday, this little tiny paragraph, and I point out that it's little tiny. Oh, just lost my cast up here. My little tiny is because we're not attorneys. We don't want to be putting a lot of stuff in there. Got to recast in here. Okay, all right. Limited home warranty. So you've had your conversation with the buyer, whether they want one. If they don't want one, you're checking the box on line 83. If they do want one, determine who's purchasing it. And if we're asking the seller to purchase it, that's what we would put in there. We would mark that box. If we're asking, okay, number one, I need to get rid of that. And then I'm going to move our little faces down here. If the buyer is going to be purchasing themselves, we check that box, but we are putting the cost in. We're checking the box on line 85, putting the cost in, saying who that we're going to be ordering that home warranty from. Another conversation I have with the buyer. Buyer's probably really not going to care too much unless they happen to have had previous experience with one and don't want to use one in particular, or do want to use one in particular. Otherwise, again, you're not making that decision for them. You're giving them all of the pamphlets and letting them make the decision themselves. Then we are also going to put the per claim deductible, also called the service fee, on here, but that's the fee that the buyer would charge anytime they have the home warranty contractor come out. So on line 89. So all of that has to be in there. And then on line 91, we are indicating who is going to be ordering that home warranty. Double check, because some sellers will have one in place. And so then we have that has to be all up to the seller or the listing agent to get that transferred over to the buyer if that's what's going to happen. But if there's not one in place already, then I would say that you are the one that should be putting it in place. So check the box that the licensee assisting the buyer, because that way we know that it's done and the information has been presented to the title company. So on this particular property, we have our seller's disclosure properly filled out, so we will check that box. We also have our lead-based paint disclosure properly filled out, and you're adding your buyer's initials and signatures to both of those forms. So we checked that box on line 101. I said I would deal with what happens if it's not on there. You will run across some where there's not one and there won't be one. Not as often as we used to run across that. What we find now is that the seller will put one in and then, right across it. I've never lived in the property so I have no idea about it. But, but interestingly enough, they're rehabbers and they tell us everything that they've done to the house, but they don't have any idea of the condition of the house or what's in the house. So it all just seems kind of funny to me. But in those rare instances when there is not going to be one available, you've asked for it, and the listing agent has said, no, they're not filling one out. There are legitimate times for that, not really, but I mean, it's acceptable times for that. You do not check the box on here, but not checking the box doesn't remove that requirement, because the seller's disclosure is referenced a few times throughout our contract. So what you do have to do then is come back up to additional terms and conditions in that box and say, buyer and seller acknowledge there is no completed seller's disclosure associated with this transaction. That is what removes the obligations of both parties, seller mostly, from what the rest of the contract says the seller is going to be doing with that seller's disclosure. You don't need it. If you need to do that, let me know.
Okay.
Okay, all right. We have verbiage for that. Jody asked me to repeat it, and he doesn't need to write it down here. None of you need to write that down here. I just need it stuck in your brain that we do need to address it if it's not in there. Okay. All right. Buyer's initialing every page of the contract. Oh, well, getting back to the negotiable terms here, because I said that's what I was part of what we're doing here today. The home warranty can be absolutely a negotiating term. If you know that you're in competition, asking for those home warranties because they are in the area of $600, $700, $800 these days. So that's a considerable expense for the seller. Again, I am not minimizing the importance of having the conversation. You have to have the conversation with the buyer, but whether or not they want to ask the seller to pay for one. If the buyer wants to pay for one, that takes that out of negotiations. But asking the seller to pay for one certainly is. Asking the seller to pay for one weakens the offer. That's not necessarily a bad thing. All right. We just have to, I'm just pointing these out. Not asking for one, not asking the seller to pay for one it strengthens the offer comparatively speaking. But again, if the house has been on the market for 4 months, they've had no other offers, the listing agent said, no, we don't have any coming in. Why not ask for one, right? That we don't know how anxious that seller is to, unless the listing agents told us. So negotiating terms. Some of the other terms that you might be able to negotiate on here as we're getting to the addenda paragraph would be the in its present condition. I don't like that form, but I know a lot of agents use it because it's kind of not needed. Our contract is written with all of that anyway, or we could put the term in there that the one term that the in its present condition offers. That we could put that in our additional terms and conditions, but because it actually causes us more problems than then it solves. So I just really don't like the form, but I understand why some agents want to use it. The buyer's not going to do any inspections. Well, that's super scary. Please don't ever, work with a buyer that's not going to do any inspections. Of course you will. That's box number 3. Box number 2 is that the buyers are going to do their inspections, but they're waiving their right to cancel the contract. Well, we could always write that in the contract without putting it as separate form along with it. Box number 1 is buyers going to do their inspections and then are waiving their they can still cancel based upon that, but would not renegotiate. Well, okay, we can put that in the contract too, but it does strengthen in some buyers' minds, it does strengthen their offer. Another negotiating tool that we might have would be to waive the appraisal gap. There's a form for that. We're going to go over all of these additional addenda in another class after the first of the year. But waiving the appraisal gap as we get into the financing portion of the contract, it does say, and as you all learned in your pre-license class, that the lender will only lend based upon the lower of the sale price or the appraised value. They'll choose the lower of that. If the appraised value comes in lower than the sale price, if the buyer's in a position to, they can tell the seller, oh, but I will make up all or some of that difference. I have enough cash to do that. Buyer has to be in the position to do that. You'd kind of have to be concerned about, and this, really this only comes into play when our buyer's making an offer way over asking price, and everybody has a little bit of concern that it might not appraise there. But so the appraisal waiver, there are other things that you can negotiate too, but those are the 2 big ones here that I'm going to expose you to here this morning. Buyer initials, that page of the contract. We went through the terms of the contract on Monday, so we're just writing the offer and the information that you have to include in the offer. We talked about this on Monday, though, the lines 136 through 143. You are making the disclosure whether you are a principal of the contract, you are a buyer, or you are a seller, and that you are licensed and where you are licensed. Also, we are making the disclosure that if either party is related to an agent involved in the transaction, either the seller or the buyer. We talked about that relationship, parent, child, sibling, spouse, fiance. I would even go so far as to say, because again, on those things, you cannot over disclose. So grandparent, in-laws, per the laws of descent, the people that you could inherit property from is really what they're looking for there. So just because it's not in my list of 5, doesn't mean that you maybe shouldn't. Now, if it's your cousin, I wouldn't worry about that, right? Right. Okay, there we have that. Purchase price. So this is what you're putting in here is what your buyer has determined they want to offer for the property based upon their feelings, their intuition, their information, the information you've gotten them, the CMA that you've done for them. They are making a well-informed decision here. Can't stress that enough. All right, so that the purchase price goes on line 164. The earnest money, and then it says right here in this paragraph that the earnest money will be delivered to the licensee assisting the seller or their escrow agent within blank calendar days, and our default there is 3. If you know that your buyer cannot get the earnest deposit in that length of time, you need to address it here, not later. You need to address it here and then explain it. If I were the listing agent, I would want to know why. And so make that explanation to the listing agent. But if you know that the buyer's going to need 4 or 5 days before they can get those funds into the escrow account, then, or to the escrow agent, then address that here. So our earnest money paragraph down here in the form of, and you on line 178, you're letting them know whether it's in a check, it's going to be a check, electronic funds transfer, or ACH. Other would be cash. Wow, cash. Who deals with cash anymore? Or it is possible, both states allow the earnest deposit to be anything that the seller would accept. That again, 40 years in the business, I've never seen a title to a car or stocks or bonds or an IOU or anything like that, but the states allow it. That's why we have it here. And we are telling the seller that that's the form of the earnest deposit, that and it can only be used if the seller agrees to accept that. Deposited with, we come back here to MLS. Back to the listing. Down here, close to the bottom right-hand side down here, earnest deposit to, and it goes to Tallgrass Title, not the title company that your buyer is going to go through. There's absolutely nothing wrong with, there's nothing wrong with your buyer using the seller's title company also. I'm not familiar with Tallgrass Title, so I might suggest to my buyer, hey, let's find our own title company to close with, one that either the buyer's familiar with or I am familiar with. Again, be real careful about that, because if you say, well, I don't know anything about Tallgrass, we're going to go to one of mine that never makes any mistakes. Because again, Murphy Law will mean that it will tell you that then that's when they'll make a mistake. So to be careful with that. But if it is a title company that you're not familiar with, there's nothing wrong with you suggesting that you not use that. But that's who the earnest deposit goes to. Nothing changes that. So that's what you're putting on the contract here, deposited with, and please, 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 line 181, refundable, refundable, refundable. That means that if the buyer cancels the contract per one of the explicit rights given to them to cancel the contract in the contract, then we can expect reasonably for the seller or buyer to receive the earnest deposit back, that the seller will release it. Now, again, we're always dependent on the seller releasing it. Never, ever, ever say to a buyer that, oh, well, yeah, you'll get your earnest deposit back, because sellers get obstinate. So, but make it refundable. There are a few times when the earnest deposit is going to be non-refundable. Specifically when you're dealing with a builder. And if the builder is building new construction. Now, if that's the case, you're not using this contract anyway. There's a new construction contract that you would be using. But if it's an existing property that the builder's already built, you're still probably going to use the new construction. Or if it's a rehab, that the rehabber is allowing the buyer to make some decisions. That makes it a little more questionable as to whether the seller is going to want to release that earnest deposit back to the buyer if the buyer changes their mind. If the seller is making adjustments to the improvement in itself that might not be attractive to other buyers. The seller might say, well, if I'm making these changes for you, I might have a hard time selling it to anybody else, so I'm going to make the earnest deposit non-refundable. Or also, if you're asking the seller to do things and the seller says, well, I'm going to keep your earnest deposit to pay for those things. Again, that's more in the construction side of things, not any repairs that we're asking the seller to make. So that's a whole different thing. So I hope I didn't confuse that issue, but I might have. Let's just say 99.9% of the time, you're going to make the earnest deposit refundable. Additional earnest money, kind of hit on this the other day. If the buyer doesn't have enough to put down to meet the seller's desires at this point in time, then we would say, okay, more to come later. A lot of times it's based on the effective date of the contract. It could be based upon successful renegotiations of inspections. So you can say that that will come at whatever future date and for whatever future reason, but it's at all of the same criteria that we said before. It's going to go to the same title company and it's going to be non-refundable. I'm sorry, I just said the wrong thing. Boop, 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 boop. Back up. Refundable. Okay. Total amount financed by the buyer. You might have to figure this based on the pre-approval letter that you have, but what goes on line 196 is the loan amount. I'm going to repeat that, is the loan amount. So sales price minus down payment. The loan amount. I know it's not terribly intuitive. And the first few times you go through this form, you're going to get confused. Lots of experienced agents still get it confused. But the loan amount goes on line 196. Then on line 201, we are doing some calculation. One of the forms in MLS and in KCRAR does do the calculations for you, or you can do your own. But what we're putting on line 201 is our purchase price minus any earnest deposit minus the loan amount. Basically, what goes on line 201 is the buyer's down payment minus the earnest deposit they're putting on the contract. Because at closing, the buyer gets that earnest deposit back and theoretically it gets applied to their down payment. Not really intuitive, and one of the things that you will probably have to catch yourself on at least the first several times. Once you get in the habit of doing it that way, it kind of makes sense. I understand why they do it that way, but it's still a little confusing. Seller compensation to broker assisting the buyer. If your buyer is asking the seller to pay your compensation, that goes on this line. That is based on what is in your buyer agency agreement and what your buyer is asking. You cannot ask for more than is reflected on your buyer agency agreement. If you say that you're charging 3% to your buyer, the $495 plus 3%, you can't say, oh, let's just ask them to pay 4% here. You can't do that without changing the buyer agency agreement. So, and just don't mess with that. So you can't ask for more. You can ask for less. If your buyer to be competitive says, well, I don't have the full 3% that I can pay you, but I can pay you 2%. Let's just ask the seller to pay for 1%. So again, negotiable item there, whatever your buyer's comfort level is. But just remember, whatever you put on the buyer's agency agreement, your buyer's on the hook for. We might ask the seller and the seller might agree to pay for all of it or some of it. But whatever the seller doesn't agree to pay, your buyer's on the hook for. So just keep that in mind. Line number 211, the additional seller paid costs. These are the closing costs that we're asking the seller to pay on behalf of the buyer. You have figured that another really important reason for you to do the estimated closing costs for your buyer is your buyer may say, well, I don't have any idea how much to ask for. You've done your estimated closing costs. And so now you know. how much additional over and above their down payment the buyers would have to bring to the table. So that's what we're asking the seller to pay here. Then very seldom would, I went over this the other day on line 216, very few times that you would put anything in that line unless you're working with a special lender provided program. So check with the lender, but conventional USDA, FHA, and VA do not require, they don't have any requirements that the buyer can't pay for something anymore they used to, but they still might apply in some specific lender provided programs. But then on line 218, we have a total of that entire subparagraph there, subparagraph F. The seller compensation, any closing costs that we're asking the seller to pay is then totaled on line 218. Your buyer initials, all pages. Here's our closing and possession date that you discussed with your buyer. And then you also verified with the listing agent what's convenient, what your buyer would prefer, but how we can accommodate the seller going in there. On line 253, the possession date, and there, if it is going to be anything different than the closing date, is the only time that you really need to put anything in here. If it's a vacant property and you're taking possession on the same day, leave 253 blank. If it's an occupied property right now, but you know the seller's going to be out before closing, leave line 253 blank. The only time that you're going to need to put anything in here would be if you are allowing the seller to have some time after closing to stay in the property. And again, a day or two. Otherwise, we have another form, but and it's not coming up nearly as often as it used to in our world. And the reason you leave this blank is because if you read it, line 253 says possession will be 5 p.m. on the closing date. Okay, we have our definition of closing that we read on Monday. And if you weren't here or you haven't watched that video, watch that video. What defines closing? Closing is closing and possession, this whole paragraph here. Closing says that when all documents have been executed and delivered and the funds are available, that closing has happened. Writing add funding in line 253, and you'll see it. Just, I don't want you doing it. Or at closing, that doesn't, in that line, that doesn't mean anything. Closing is defined. We are given a time here. Now, if you are allowing the seller to stay in the property, you definitely need to put a specific date and a specific time in here, because that's the only thing that's enforceable. All right. At funding is not enforceable. At closing is not enforceable. We have our closing date at 5 p.m. That's enforceable, but only if closings happen. So there you go. All right. Our appraised value contingency, there's a blank here. If it's a cash sale, buyer can do an appraisal. 5 days is probably enough time, and that's our default here. Or the inspection period, not 5 days, but inspection period is probably enough time to get an appraisal ordered and done for a cash sale. If there's again, going back to the lender's only going to loan on the lesser, I've got to start talking fast here because I'm down to my last 10 minutes here in class. The final appraised value, negotiable, again, it would only become a problem if we think that if we think it's going to be a problem, that the house isn't going to appraise. Now, sometimes we don't know that they don't even think that there's a problem, and we're all surprised when that appraisal comes in low. So, be prepared for that too. But probably at this point in time, not a lot of reason to negotiate different timeframes for that to happen. The 5 days to get the appraisal to the sellers, probably plenty. 5 days for renegotiation may not be, but you can deal with that if and when that situation comes up. Contract not contingent or is contingent if your buyer has to sell their property, which your pre-approval letter will tell you. And then ask the lender if there's any wiggle on that. The buyer may have requested that. So, and either way, the buyer is making the decision whether they're going to make it contingent or not contingent on here. But you have to choose one of those two. You're letting the seller know if it's cash sale or a finance sale. All of this information, type of financing, we talked about that. We've talked about that before in class too. But this is the information you're going to get from your pre-approval letter. This right here, this question right here is what I talked about, why you need to talk with the lender about whether the buyer has to cap their interest rate or whether they can float it. Because you have to let the seller know that in this paragraph of the financing or on these lines of the financing paragraph, you're letting our seller know who the buyer is pre-approved with. You're going to be checking the box on line 253 and on line 254, putting the lending institution and the loan officer's name. Didn't deal with this the other day. I deal with this in my pre-license class and in some of the contracts classes. If your buyer has gotten a pre-approval letter from a lender that the seller or the listing agent doesn't want to work with, that's a negotiable item. The seller may come back and say, I want you to get pre-approved with. And if the buyer's agreeable to that, no reason for them not to really at that point, because that's the indication. The listing agent may tell you why they're asking for that, but they're not obligated to, just becomes a negotiable item. Right. Loan approval, we talked about that the other day. Not any reason really for you to change this. You don't want to obligate the lender to do something that you don't know that the lender can do. The lender appraisal requirements, we talked about that. Again, negotiable term here. If leave it blank, we're not obligating the seller to do anything. So that kind of strengthens your offer. If you do, however, know that there are going to be things that an FHA appraiser is going to ask for, go ahead and address it here too. You may think that, well, Linda's saying this is going to weaken my offer, which maybe it does a little bit, but it also helps prevent problems in the future, right? If and the seller can say no. The seller can say, no, I'm going to agree to zero now. If something comes up later, we'll agree to it, or we'll negotiate it. We might agree to it. So, but negotiable term there. All of those things that are non-negotiable, they are terms that can be changed, but they're non-negotiable. We get down to our inspection period, paragraph number 13. Here's where our default is 10 days in here. We need to look with the calendar, check with the buyer's schedule to make sure that that 10 days works for them. And then also, again, if you think that there are going to be things that are going to need a second set of eyes looking at, you think, well, they tell us that the roof is 15 years old. Again, that's the end of its expected life. Might need to get a roofer out there that you can't get out the same day. Might not be able to get a chimney sweep out on the same day you have the whole house inspection done. So keeping all of that in mind. And also if there are any holidays coming up, if your offer timeline and acceptance timeline is probably going to include 2 weekends. I pretty much, unless we're in a real competitive market, I pretty much do extend this and just ask for 12 days or 14 days. So look at your calendar. If you're trying to make a really strong offer and you've already had your conversation with your inspector and know that they can get out there, you can shorten this time period. That strengthens the offer too, negotiable item. We talked about adding additional structures into the wood destroying insect. Not an acceptable condition would be, I think I talked about this the other day too. It wouldn't be anything that you would necessarily put in your offer. Again, unless you are trying to make a really strong offer. You can say, we are not going to use the old HVAC system as an unacceptable condition. I don't like seeing this because, so I'm not even going to talk about it. So you'll see that some agents put a dollar amount in there. I think that kind of confuses the issue too. I think it's better if you can exclude a specific item rather than putting a dollar amount in there. And you'll see the agents that want to try to do that. Oh, I guess one thing that I didn't go back and point out on MLS that I will. Buyers initialing all of these pages. We're getting down here to page 13. So I said the other day, it is up to you. We don't ask anybody to sign something that's not completely filled in. So it's our responsibility to fill in everything about the listing agent. So all of our choices here, chances are is going to be designated agent, transaction broker, or seller's agent. So that if it's a property through MLS, and we're pretending that it is here, at least sometimes here. So what we have here is we come down to our middle section here where we have our identification of our broker, our agent, and then the contact information for the broker and the agent. And then you'll look down here and see LACAP. LACAP stands for Listing Agent Capacity. So you will take whatever they say here on MLS and apply it to our contract. That one said designated agent, so you're going to be clicking designated seller's agent. I'm getting ahead of myself here. All right, that's what they are. You will always be designated buyer's agent. Again, it's surprising how many experienced agents aren't clear on this, but you as new agents, you know how this works, all right? So you're looking at MLS to see how that is, how they are, what their status is reflected on MLS. Down here on line 717, you are also then, if we're asking the seller to pay our compensation, you're clicking that box. Most sellers that, in my experience, are not agreeing to pay for the buyer's $495 or $395 or whatever it is you charge. Even if we ask for it, sellers are saying, no, I'm not paying that. So chances are then you're going to be checking both boxes on this line because both seller and buyer are going to be paying some compensation. We never on this form have to disclose how much, just that they are paying. All right, as we are sending the offer over, your buyer sign here, since you are the one filling out this specific information and you are making disclosures about yourself, you also sign on this page, line 721, over here on the right-hand side, on the buyer's side. That's the one paragraph, the one page throughout the contract that your buyer doesn't have to initial because they've already signed. Also, just to make clear too, which I know I didn't do this the other day, these signatures on this page specifically says right here on line 719, the signatures below only apply to the brokerage relationship disclosure because state license law, both states require that we make this disclosure. This is not agreeing to any other terms in the contract, just that they understand, but all parties understand that this disclosure has been made. And that's all they're saying there. Getting down to, we talked about all of that last week, evidence of title. That's one of the things, if the buyer wanted to make a really strong offer, and if the buyer has the ability to, the buyer can offer to pay some of the seller closing costs and would include the title work and the title policy. Could also include some of the sellers paying for their own agent broker compensation over there too. If your buyer's saying, no, I'm not going to ask the seller for that, I want to be super competitive, I'm going to pay you everything that I owe you that I agreed to on there, and I'm going to pay some of the sellers too. Perfectly legitimate, legal, and one of those strong negotiating terms. We then get to our expiration here. The offer will expire on our contract default is 5 days. That's too long to keep an offer out there unless it's a foreclosure or unless you're dealing with the corporation because they don't work weekends and they don't work evenings. So they may tell you that when you don't expect any answer, until Friday or, whatever day of the week. That's the only time I would leave that blank here. Otherwise, when you are submitting an offer to an actual real seller, a person or a local LLC, then 24 to 48 hours should be plenty. Another question for you to ask though, when you're talking with the listing agent and that initial conversation is the seller available? Do I have to allow extra time for an expiration? When can you get with the seller here? So your buyer's going to sign here. You will be filling out all of your information and your brokerage information on the buyer's side over here, the right-hand side. You are also, as a courtesy and makes your offer look super good, you're also going to be filling in the listing broker's information and the listing agent's information, which again, coming back over here to MLS, is all right here. You've got the broker's name, you've got the agent's name, you've got the agent's phone number and the broker phone number right there, and the agent's email address. All of that is asked for in that form. The one thing that's not readily available right here is it's asking for the brokerage address. To get the brokerage address, you come onto MLS, the live form here, and click on the broker's name there. And that gives you a pop-up here with all of that broker's information. And it's got their street address right up here. So all of that is filled in, and yes, you will be doing that. If you haven't done that on an offer that you're sending me as the contracts coach to review, I'm going to suggest that you do that. You want to do everything that you possibly can to put yourself and your buyer in the best possible light. Then once your buyer has signed it, and it comes back to you before you send it off, you're going to be signing down here on line 880, and all you are signing here, because you're not a party to the contract, is that you're attesting to the fact that no one has made any changes to the form unless they are clearly marked in the contract. So, and you can only attest to that once you've gotten it back from the buyer, that they haven't made any changes to it. You're only allowing them to sign it anyway. Any editing they're trying to do, you'll be notified through dotloop. All right, that's it. I stopped in plenty of time. There's nobody here. I'm going to stop share. Nobody to be asking questions on Zoom. But if you have any questions about any of this, if you're watching this in the future video on Digital Chalk, feel free to reach out to me, contractscoach@kwinkc.com, or my phone number 913-219-2289. And then I'm going to wrap up here because we're getting ready to go to another meeting. So let me know if there's any way that I can be of help as you're writing a contract, as you're preparing to write a contract. Reach out to me with any questions. All right, see you later. Be sure and check in.